Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for that kickoff. That was a great discussion. And if you wish to pursue that, I'll leave that up to you and your mastermind groups. So we're talking about leading the boss. And what are we going to discuss? Well, sort of three topics I want to bring up. First, leading the boss can be challenging. It's sort of a blinding flash of the obvious. I'm sure all of you will agree with that. Second question, how can you be a good follower? And there's a great body of knowledge coming out on so-called followership. Then third question, how, if you are the leader, can you create a climate in which you can, in fact, be led? And we'll touch on that at the very end of this particular workshop. So the first dimension of our paradigm, leading the boss, and I would argue you lead the boss consciously or unconsciously. And again, smart bosses want to be led. I often say it doesn't do any good if you're the captain of the ship, if somebody comes up to you and says, oh, by the way, boss, we're 6 inches from the iceberg. That's interesting. It's just not terribly useful. Coming up and telling him or her that we're 6 miles from the iceberg, that's useful. And therefore, that's the kind of climate you want to create. And we know if we're in an organization, we are in fact leading our boss, but we're doing that consciously or unconsciously. But as I said, that can be a challenge. Now imagine you're working for this lady. This is Governor Miriam Ma Ferguson. And Governor Ferguson was the first female governor of the great state of Texas. And again, this is what she said about bilingual education in 1925. And I'll read it to you, but I'm sure you've already seen it. If English was good enough for Jesus, it is good enough for me. Now imagine you're a member of her staff and you're trying to talk to her and lead her. Otherwise, that could be a real challenge. But at the same time, I would argue everybody needs somebody to advise them, to give them feedback, to keep them within certain guardrails, if you will, particularly when the organization may be at a difficult moment or is involved in a crisis. And you see this cartoon here, probably goes back to the caveman, one guy trying to lead his boss by saying, get down before you hurt yourself. Now the patch you see there is that of a command sergeant major. Bear with me for using a military example. But I often found it curious that the military culture, we actually institutionalize this leading the boss into our organizational culture, because at each level of command, there's a senior non-commissioned officer, a command sergeant major, a first sergeant, a platoon sergeant, and his or her job is to be the senior enlisted advisor to their respective commanders. I commanded a battalion during the Gulf War. My command sergeant major, Joe McFadden, God rest his soul, who is now deceased, would come into my office before we deployed, and the same when we were deployed. He would invariably be carrying in one hand a cigarette and the other hand a cup of coffee, because you could do that in those days. And he would tell me in no uncertain terms how badly I was about to screw up. And he would use, well, frankly, a lot of rather, let's just say, aggressive, inflammatory language, usually with 4 letters. He would put "sir" at the end of the statement. Now, I appreciated that very much because that was enormously useful to me. I didn't always agree with Joe, but having that kind of feedback, having that somebody who could speak sort of truth to power was invaluable. And also, as a sidelight, or perhaps a slight digression, I used to institutionalize what I call the duck rule for my people to think about when things were difficult and perhaps talk to me. I would always tell them the following. 1, if things are going really bad, and you think you need to talk to me, you do need to talk to me. Bad news does not get better with age. You need to lead the boss, particularly when things are bad. Again, 6 miles from the iceberg, not 6 inches. Second of all, if you see something happening, if it looks like a duck, if it walks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. And you don't want to be the one person trying to explain that, no, in fact, this is a horse. And that's a guiding rule for you to imagine how things may be going astray. Well, this leading the boss is very important. And here you see a comment by Penny Hersher, who's the CEO of First Rain. She talks about that person who will speak to you and tell you the truth is the most valuable person in your life. And when you're talking to the boss, you're leading the boss, sometimes what you have to think about is how I go about framing that in a way he or she will hear. Some people argue one way of going about doing that would be to craft it in a couple of questions. If you're in a meeting and the boss comes up with something that you can tell the team does not actually embrace, but he or she is very passionate about that, and you think you have been that person who can speak truth to power, one way you might describe that is simply by saying, hey boss, what was the intended outcome you're trying to achieve during this meeting? And how are you hoping that the team would in fact respond and act? So you're trying to get them to grapple with the disparity between what they were trying to accomplish, the objective, and the actual outcomes. But again, Penny Hersher is absolutely correct. Everybody needs that one person that can talk to them and tell them the truth. Otherwise, you can become very isolated. And more on that in a second. So when you think about leading the boss, I would ask you to consider these three questions. This is a great book you might consider by John Baldoni, Lead Your Boss. There's another book by a guy named Mike Ursine called Leading Up. Mike Ursine at the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. And these three questions are very simple. What does your boss really need? What does the team need? And what can I do to help the team and the leader succeed? Because both these things need to succeed. The team needs to succeed. If the team succeeds, the boss is going to succeed. These are invariably linked. And it has to do with thinking about a combination of, again, of critical questions and enthusiastic participation, okay? How do we transfer the goals, ambition of ego, the leader, to exactly the team? And remembering when the team succeeds, the leader succeeds as well. So if you're going to be a good follower, you got to think about the following things. What's my leader's comfort zone? What are his or her values? Where have they come from? Does they appear to be supported or lonely? Do they seem to be secure? What appears to be their failures, fears, or aspirations? That's going to be particularly difficult when a new boss comes into an organization. That transition is a difficult moment for you to establish your relationship with the boss if, in fact, you become that one person that they rely on to give them positive or negative feedback, in fact, tell them the truth they need to hear. And once you've identified that comfort zone, how do I stay within that comfort zone? And then how do I expand that comfort zone for the boss? And let me look at a couple of examples.